Again, so happy to be here. Good afternoon. It's so nice to see some friendly, familiar faces in the audience. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Amanda Florence Goodenough. I use she and her pronouns, and I was born and raised and still reside here in Wisconsin. And I'm wondering, maybe at least for those of you who are here by a show of hands, is that true for any of you in the audience? How many of you were born and raised and still reside here in Wisconsin? Okay, so I have some fellow Wisconsinites. Awesome. So, well, whether or not you were born here or raised here, or you're passing through, whatever the case, I'm curious to know what images come to mind when you think about Wisconsin. America's dairyland, sometimes included in America's heartland, part of the good old Midwest. What are some of the first images or words that come to mind when you think about Wisconsin or the Midwest? So think about that, and then here's where we can try to use this as an engagement tool. So again, those of you who are joining from the live stream, hopefully you were able to catch that QR code as well, and then you can enter in a word of an image or something that comes to mind when you think of Wisconsin, the Midwest, America's dairyland. And so if you're not familiar with how word clouds work, the more often the more often a word is repeated, the larger it becomes. So lots of people said cows, cheese, seeing Packers, farmers, farms, cheese, beer, white people, oop, oh, yes, oop, oop. Friendly, red barns, forest, God's country, racism, agriculture. Okay, I'm going to give you just a few more moments. Great place to raise a family. Okay. So here are some of the first images that come up when I asked Google. Right, we got the Wisconsin welcomes you, some nice windy roads and fall colors, kayaking, farm country, and there's the cows that many of you said. Now, can anyone identify this image? Anyone in the audience, if you can just shout it out? Okay, yeah. Do any of you associate this picture with Wisconsin? No? Okay. Well, as a 7-year-old, I was convinced that I lived in the Badlands. Not because of the beauty of this national park, but because I had heard of this place before, and it was the only name that seemed fitting for the neighborhood that we moved into. We traveled many miles, guided by a compass of dreams, and entered a black and white world with winds of bitter ignorance. The Badlands, I called them, populated with narrow-minded civilians living secluded in their discriminating comfort circles. They hid behind lifeless bushes, but stepped out with no hesitation to make it known that they desired not our company. They dared not live in a colored world. So we settled, because they doubted our strength to survive their coldness. We looked no further towards the fields of gold, gleaming around the corner, screaming for our company. We took a stand for the sake of pride and became immune to their degrading medicine as we became only stronger. And so, when searching for our future, we coincidentally found our past, a past we heard about in textbooks, heard about from previous generations, somehow repeated or never completely abolished, now living it more mildly, most willingly. Because how would we explain their footsteps tattooed over us had we conformed? Instead, we point to our path and tell stories of how we made it in a world that didn't want us to. That was a poem I wrote in elementary school, edited and revised once I gained a middle school vocabulary and a deeper perspective of my existence in Wisconsin as part of the growing 2%. As a light-skinned Black, Mexican, and Native multiracial child who spent formative years in southeastern Wisconsin, came of age in southwestern Wisconsin and has now settled here in the Coulee region of Wisconsin. Being part of the 2% for me meant inheriting racialized historical trauma, witnessing racism, enduring discrimination, and experiencing white rage and white backlash. In fact, another image of my Wisconsin experience is one like this. Because we shared a property line with a neighbor I refer to as Snoop Dogg. Now, not because he shared any resemblance to the rapper. He was just a Snoop, as in someone who pries, who is nosy, and entitled to act in that way. Being regularly surveilled by this neighbor is an image seared into my memory. He would casually stroll along our property line with hands clasped behind his back, whistling nonchalantly while he reported to duty, his self-appointed duty, I guess, to monitor all activity that might happen on our property. He wouldn't say hi. He was not discreet in his monitoring. He was not deterred by our presence outside, noticing him police us. He, like most of the neighborhood, did not want us there. We brought no value to the neighborhood, decreased the value, perhaps. And so he watched for any opportunity to report us for wrongdoing. An expired license plate, too many vehicles in the driveway. My dad was a mechanic, just existing while black and brown. And this started when I was in second grade. And he continued to do this across years. Eventually, the trees on the property grew bigger, obstructing his view and requiring him to bring out binoculars to look into our garages, our windows. In fact, at some point, the trees grew so tall that he had to start climbing them in order to get a clearer view of our property. And this was our normal. And there was no system we could turn to. Most of the community, the town board, protected that behavior, and everyone else who also tried to make our lives miserable. There were many other people and forces working against us, but his actions are some of my most vivid memories. It was so normal that I never really talked about it until I left that town for college. Maybe it wasn't safe to discuss it before then, or maybe I tried and got discouraged, or I don't know. But in college, in a new community, the world that I knew became challenged just by being exposed to different worlds. I was able to make more meaning of the racism and the harassment. I found space and permission and validation to name it that. And as a sophomore in college, over 12 years later, I remember telling my then boyfriend about our neighbor, Snoop Dogg. And I have no idea if he believed me. As I said it out loud, it sounded ridiculous to even me. And I had lived it. Completely absurd. However, there came a day when I brought that boyfriend home to meet my family, but it wasn't just my parents he got to see. Because way up in the tree, with binoculars and all, sat Snoop Dogg. And there was something powerful about having that boyfriend get plucked out of his world and thrown into mine to bear witness. Across time and tears, I learned that it is not my pain or my trauma, not my pain to own or my trauma to stay in relationship with. It is part of my story, but becoming more than my pain required healing. And that healing is not just mine to move through. It was and is ours. That boyfriend who eventually became my husband, that Snoop Dogg, everyone. We've got to facilitate individual and collective racial healing. Most of us across all racialized lines live with racialized trauma, right, of our own. Some of us can access it more easily. Some of us don't know that we live with it, but it's in all of us. Trauma is not a flaw or a weakness. It is a highly effective tool of safety and survival. It is also not an event. Trauma is the body's protective response to an event or series of events that it perceives as potentially dangerous. Trauma is never a personal failing, and it is never something a person can choose. It is always something that happens to someone. And this is according to Resmaa Menakem. So when it comes to racism and white supremacy, even though white Americans benefit from that system and experience advantages and gains, often at the expense of people of color, I would argue that white folks have lost a lot too. And as Resmaa claims, no matter what we look like, if we were born and raised in America, white body supremacy and our adaptations to it are in our blood, passed on in our DNA expression. Our very bodies house the unhealed dissonance and trauma of our ancestors, all of us. Or as my cousin says, trauma unhealed is trauma transferred. So racial healing does not occur in a vacuum. Much of the mending that we need to do takes place in connection with others, like this community-wide effort. So this is about collective communal healing, because when you don't heal, it is hard for me to heal. And because when healing takes place, it has a ripple effect. So, a few things to ground us before we move into this. This is my journey of being a person of the global majority, but Wisconsin minority. It spans 42 years and is further informed by almost 20 years of professional observations, consistent, even predictable patterns, reinforced by the weight of thousands of stories I hold. This is my journey of arriving in segregated places and navigating Midwest faces and being on the quest toward healing. It may be a window for some of you to look through, a mirror for some of you to see some of your racialized experiences reflected back, but I'm not claiming for this to be anyone else's journey but my own. And I don't share it for your opinion or for your sympathy. It is not offered up for comparison or debate. I have receipts of the coded racism. I have petitions full of neighbors' signatures. I have newspaper clippings of my family's racial discrimination lawsuit. I have audio recordings of my father recounting the pipe bombs in our mailbox and the death threats. And I hang on to this evidence because people resist my story. And resistance sabotages healing for me and many Black, Indigenous people of color. But I don't owe anyone this evidence or even my story, and instead processing and recounting has been a part of my healing journey. This isn't true for everyone. It can be re-traumatizing to share some of the things that I'm sharing, right? It's healing for me currently, and this wasn't always the case, and it may not be a part of my healing journey in the future as I move farther along, but it's where I'm at today. And I always move through my journey on the shoulders of giants, propped up by many folks who came before me, my sisters, my parents, my ancestors. And particularly today, there are concepts and ideas that I will be amplifying from certainly the Waking Up White book read, as well as these 3 books. So Robin DiAngelo, Resmaa Menakem, and Annalise Singh. So you might hear me say some of their names as we move through. And you can add this to your suggested reading list as well. So, number 2, racism absolutely goes beyond, across and beyond the Black and white binary. And I'm operating from the belief that anti-Blackness is the root of white supremacy. that anti-blackness is the anchor that holds white supremacy in place. We need to acknowledge the full spectrum of race and racism, yes. But so long as we avoid erasure, it can be helpful or even necessary to follow the spectrum to both ends, the extremes, to focus on the most marginalized, not from an oppression Olympics framework, but in the spirit of the curb cut phenomenon, where everyone benefits. So if you're not familiar, the curb cut, that small ramp built into the curb of a sidewalk, was designed for people who use wheelchairs, but it also made navigation easier for people using strollers or pushing carts or pulling luggage. The curb cut effect is the phenomenon of disability-friendly features being used and appreciated by a larger group than the people they were designed for. Or like hearing people who use closed captioning. It's the idea that an investment in one group can cascade out and up and be a substantial investment in the broader well-being of a nation, one whose policies and practices create an equitable economy, a healthy community of opportunity, and just society. So you will hear a lot of focus on that white-black binary, but there's so much more than that, and everyone will benefit from focusing when we need to focus on the extremes and the ends of the spectrum. Number 3, I will be using language that communicates groupness or group membership, so white people, people of color, people of the global majority, BIPOC folks, Black, Indigenous, people of color. This collapses many diverse racial groups into too big of a category. And bases folks in adjacent roles to whiteness. But it also disrupts the white supremacy of individualism. So Robin DiAngelo talks about individualism as a deeply embedded narrative in Western cultures, and it plays a particular important role in the maintenance of white supremacy. So I talk about groupness in a way that's different than stereotypes. These are well-documented, well-researched patterns. And so when I think about groupness, for at least in my experience, for people of color, or being a person of color, being seen as an individual outside of race is not always a privilege that can be granted. And so, for example, whenever I watch the news, and especially like in this area, and if there was a crime that was committed, my initial first thought isn't like, I hope like everyone's okay. I'm like, please don't let the criminal or suspect look like my dad, look like my family, look like my cousins. I hate that, but that's an honest recount of what it means oftentimes to be associated with a group and not given the privilege to be an individual. But we are all members of racial groups that profoundly shape the trajectory of our lives, and so that's why groupness matters. And the last point of grounding is that decentering whiteness is not anti-white. So a few points here. Especially around conversations of race and racism, I strive to center feelings of Black, Indigenous, people of color. I won't get this right. I am a recovering rule follower and have been very conditioned to keep white people comfortable. The second point, sometimes the way to center BIPOC folks, again, that's Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC folks' feelings, their learning, their growth, liberation, is by decentering white feelings and white learning and white growth. But I want to be clear, decentering whiteness is not anti-white. And this approach doesn't mean that I don't care about white folks' feelings or growth. It just means I'm not striving to center you. And that can feel uncomfortable, might feel anti-white, as sometimes I've gotten that response, right, or strange. But consider the possibility that those feelings that may come up with you is because you're always used to being centered. Your feelings are always centered, your growth is always centered. So if you experience any of that, it is not anti-white. I'm striving to center the feelings of people of color in these conversations around race and racism. And I should also state that sometimes decentering whiteness, ironically maybe, means naming whiteness. Because whiteness stays centered by being unnamed. And so my last point with this is that whiteness is not just white people when I talk about it. In my message, whiteness is likely in all of us and is a characteristic internalized and enacted by BIPOC folks as well. So, hang on to these thoughts and lean into any discomfort and humility as we make 3 stops along my journey. Midwest faces, segregated places, and then arriving at healing. So let's start here. First stop, nice. All right, I'm going to try to facilitate a really quick pair share because we don't have a lot of time. So if you feel comfortable turning to somebody next to you, great. If not, if you're not about the pair share lifestyle, just maybe do a silent reflection to yourself. But I want to ask you, what does it mean to be Midwest nice? How do you define that? So go ahead, quickly turn to somebody next to you if you will, or just think about that to yourself, and then we'll come back together. Okay, I'll give you about 30 more seconds. Anyone joining on the live stream or here and not talking to someone, you can add it to the poll, but about 30 more seconds. Okay, so I'm hearing kind of a lull. So not wanting to hurt others' feelings, passive-aggressive, openness, smile, not always truthful but polite, smoothing over rough places with cream, white savior, don't speak up, superficial politeness, silence, often disingenuine, not confrontational, subtle racism, low-key racist. Okay. So lots of different thoughts. These might be some that people are sharing from the audience or from the live stream. Hot dish. I was wondering if that would come up. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to keep moving forward. Thank you for your engagement. So Midwest nice is a virtue sometimes called kindness interchangeably, sometimes called polite. Some people have different definitions for that. But various sources online define Midwest nice as a cultural stereotype applied to the behavior of people from the Midwest United States, implying residents are usually courteous, reserved, mild-mannered, and passive-aggressive. Midwest nice is polite friendliness, an aversion to open confrontation, a tendency toward understatement, a disinclination to make a direct fuss or stand out, apparent emotional restraint, and self-deprecation. Okay, so some Midwest niceisms that I found while I was searching are apologizing involuntarily when scooting past someone, both to warn of your presence and to express regret for any inconvenience your mere existence may have caused. It could mean putting your paper plate upside down in the trash at the Labor Day barbecue so you don't offend whoever made the stuff you didn't eat. Midwest nice, can you help me with this thing? If not, totally okay, absolutely no pressure. In fact, if you'd rather run me over with a car, that's completely fine. I'm sorry for asking. Right? Or sometimes people talk about how Midwest folks greet people with, how are you? And then don't stay long enough to even hear the response, right? We just carry on. So think about some of, if you are a product of Midwest culture, think about some of your Midwest niceisms. I know for me, I was like, I say interesting, and interesting means lots of things, right? But I might be like, oh, that's interesting. And it's not really interesting. It's a lot of other things that I just don't want to say. Or I'll say, we'll see. I say that all the time to my kids when I'm not like trying to make any commitment or not trying to say no. I'll just be like, we'll see. And sometimes I also like saying that's nice, or even that somebody is really nice, has a lot different meaning for me, especially in some of these conversations. So it isn't always a compliment when I'm like, they're really nice. So in the realm of race, and well-meaning whiteness in particular, these are a few. There's a lot more we could add. If we had time, we could certainly crowdsource. But some Midwest niceisms when it comes, especially from well-meaning whiteness, might sound like I don't see color. I don't have a racist bone in my body. I would never want to say or do anything racially hurtful, but don't you dare tell me I have said or done anything racially hurtful. Which starts to get into this Midwest nice. A character trait instilled by parents, a culture I see permeates throughout K-12 education, like named as a value, and then transferred into workplaces. Syl Jones says this Midwest nice is not so much about being nice, but is more about keeping up appearances, maintaining the social order, and keeping people in their place. Paul Kick said, to live in the Midwest is to experience two realities. The first, all sunshine and bland pleasantries among other potluck suppering churchgoers. The other, a red-lit underworld where people relay vulgarities through the learned second language of euphemism, eye rolls, and loaded silence. I share this with you because what I found along my journey is that Midwest nice is conditional. And one of those conditions is that niceness is not guaranteed when I talk about race. Niceness is harder to come by when that race conversation turns into that racism conversation, and all bets are off if I name whiteness or white privilege. What lies just beneath the surface is a niceness that is not so nice. So these are just a few responses, anonymous of course, from probably nice people here in the greater La Crosse area within just the last month or so. After I was asked to give a presentation or a training or a workshop. You were completely racist, rude, and it sucks that the whole audience bought into your message. This presentation was very abrasive. Your leftist agenda is poisoning our nation. She should not be allowed on this campus. Your presentation stirs up hate for people. Some of the initial information was all right, but then it just got racial. I hope you tone that down. Your keynote was ignorant at best and demoralizing at worst. I felt attacked as a person that I have to be the one to change. I am offended by the picture you are painting for Mukwonago. When I shared some of my story of surviving Mukwonago, someone was offended. Indoctrination continues. Your talk was a waste of time. And this list does not capture my experience of being invited to a local organization to talk about racism and then being violently interrupted for doing just that and accused of saying things I didn't say because somebody's worldview was being challenged. Or a powerful person in this community throwing a nonverbal tantrum to make it clear that he wasn't interested in anything I had to say, and then passing a handwritten note to his supervisor asking if he had to stay and sit through my presentation because he wanted to leave. Or the many other stories I carry with me while navigating these conversations and existing in my skin. And these were just from very recently and in this area, right? They're much more, much worse. But here's the thing. It's not fun to be the receiver of that anger, and sometimes even makes me question my safety. But I actually think that some of these feelings, these interactions, have the potential to be a mile marker on the path toward healing, particularly when these arguments and positions are expressions of what Resmaa calls clean pain and not dirty pain. And only for those who don't get stuck or decide to make a U-turn or to get back on the path of least resistance. And unfortunately, I've seen a lot of U-turns. Like Jay Smooth says, most Americans avoid race conversations like the plague. But why? Robin DiAngelo said, I cannot think of any other social issue where it is legitimately suggested that the most effective way to address that issue is to never speak of it. So, next stop, segregated places. So even outside of Wisconsin, many or most of us grow up in racial segregation and continue to live segregated lives into and throughout adulthood. Even in urban areas, most white people don't actually lead integrated lives. I didn't say all, but many, if not most, do not actually lead integrated lives despite the racial diversity that may surround them, often through the result of gentrification. Our schools, as research shows, are still deeply segregated in 2021. In fact, there's a lot of data that shows today's schools are nearly as segregated as they were before Brown versus Board of Education. Most of us live segregated lives. But Wisconsin, according to this 2020 study, is the most racially segregated state in the country. A state likely filled with many sundown towns, although not necessarily confirmed. If you're not familiar, James Lowen, you can look up his really important work. Places maintained white on purpose through policy and ordinance. Racially segregated lives. This is very easy to do, especially for white folks. Because even though, according to the 2020 census, the images up here are from 2010, even though Wisconsin is becoming more racially diverse, with large growth within the Latinx population, Wisconsin is still predominantly white. The 2020 numbers are 85.43% white. And these pie charts, the one on the left, show the racial composition of Wisconsin, and then it compares it to the Midwest, and then you can see kind of the overall picture of the entire country. So how Wisconsin is less racially diverse than the Midwest as a whole, and then much less racially diverse than the nation. But again, despite increased diversity, and even within metropolitan areas or rural areas where there is a large population of racially diverse folks, many of us still live segregated lives. So I often will ask people to do a little inventory exercise. Lots of people will ask these questions of just like, and especially for white folks, again, because given these statistics, it's important for all of us to ask these questions, but I specifically like to speak to white folks to look around you, right? Did you grow up in an integrated neighborhood? Did you attend integrated schools? Who do you bring home into your home when looking across racial lines, racial and ethnic lines? If you're in a position to hire people, who do you hire? Who do you promote? Robin DiAngelo asked people, if you are married, what would I see when I look at your wedding album? Who would I see? Sometimes we ask, when did you have your first teacher of color? When did you have your first supervisor or boss of color? Right, so we've had some laws that have changed, but there are many attitudes that haven't. Some certainly have, but not all attitudes have changed, and certainly not all structures have changed. Right, so even with growing numbers, even in the La Crosse area, of folks of color, leadership is still disproportionately white. Structures are set up still disproportionately white. And so given the segregated lives that we lead, it warrants reflection, again, especially for white folks as the dominant majority group, especially if you're someone who has ever gotten defensive about this, any suggestion that you're racist, or if you remain confident that you harbor no racial bias, no racial prejudice, if this is some of your reality, how do you know you're not racist? How do you know you harbor no racial bias or prejudice? If never or rarely put to the test, if you don't have any accountability measures to challenge racial prejudices that might show up in you, how can we be so confident about this? When we zoom out a bit, in one recent analysis that ranked the states on an index of racial inequality, the 12 states of the Midwest census region, so Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, North Dakota, Ohio, South Dakota, and Wisconsin, they claimed 8 of the bottom 10 slots and swept the bottom 5. So some of these places, right, with the starkest settings for racial inequality or disparity, there's this jarring juxtaposition. While these states typically crowd the best to live lists, they're also among the very worst places to live for African Americans and perhaps many other BIPOC folks that we don't always have the statistics for. So when we come back to Wisconsin, racial inequality is a defining feature for this state. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but this was a recent study. I don't have the source right now. You can feel free to send me a question and I can get you that, something about race in the heartland. But here's where Wisconsin ranks. This is the backdrop of Wisconsin, the most racially segregated place filled with Midwest nice faces. This is Midwest culture. 4th worst for infant mortality. Again, when we're looking across racial lines, again, this is really looking at the white-black binary. Child poverty, 4th worst. 8th grade math scores, worst. This is out of the country. Out of school suspension, 2nd worst. Bachelor's degree, worst. Incarceration, 2nd worst. Employment, unemployment, income, home ownership, voter participation. This is Midwest culture for Wisconsin. And there's something I want to share about culture from Resmaa Menakem. He says, unhealed trauma acts like a rock thrown into a pond. It causes ripples that move outward, affecting many other bodies over time. After months or years, unhealed trauma can appear to become part of someone's personality. Over even longer periods of time, as it is passed on and gets compounded through other bodies in a household, it can become a family norm. And if it gets transmitted and compounded through multiple families and generations, it can start to look like culture. So, too many of us, for too long, have moved through a racialized state, a racialized world, with an unracialized identity. But once we realize this, right, which for me started at age 6, and for some others might not have started until age 60, right? But once we realize this, that we can't exist outside of the social forces of race or be untouched by the racist conditioning, the practices, and the outcomes of that result, then we can arrive at this last step, the step of healing, a restoration to wholeness, a repair to damage, the action of setting right. Resmaa says, we will not change racism and white supremacy through training, traditional education, or other appeals to the cognitive brain. We need to begin with the body and its relation to trauma. We need to engage in racial healing. Now, as outlined by Annalise Singh, racial healing means we begin to unlearn the stereotyped racial messages we internalized about our own race and the race of others. It means we, as individuals, learn to recognize the wounds that racism creates in us, whether we are white or a person of color. Healing means we open our eyes to the costs of racism, which are pretty much everywhere, and work to stop participating, either knowingly or actively, in the system of racism and white supremacy that was designed to favor some people and not others. We learn to notice how our race drives the differential privileges and access to needed resources we might receive, and we take action to change systems of racism. One of the quotes that I hang on to in my healing journey is, if you don't heal what cut you, you will bleed on people who didn't hurt you. If you don't heal what cut you, you will bleed on people who didn't hurt you. So, a few things to move us toward healing. Finding our intergenerational resilience. And this certainly, I think, is a message for everyone, but I really am centering my BIPOC friends in this moment. And this is something that I wanted to share. So when my mom died in 2007, I remember thinking that I would not have the strength to wake up the next day and exist in a world that she didn't physically. Right? I remember that feeling. How will I even wake up? How will I get myself out of bed? But I did somehow. I moved through that pain, and I remember this other quote that I hung on to that said, "You never know how strong you are until strong is the only option." And I think about things like that, like my mom, and I was like, oh, that was painful, it was hard, but it made me stronger. Linking myself always to that pain, it made me stronger. But again, that quote said, I was already strong. Right? You never know how strong you are until strong is the only option. That doesn't mean I wasn't strong before that. And so I think about that also with racism in Mukwonago that I experienced. As I was on the beginnings of my healing journey, I remember thinking about that, like, why did we stay in that community? And I remember thinking, and I was a leader in school. I was, assumed lots of titles, mostly because of something that my dad instilled in me, right? You have to make a name for yourself, otherwise someone else will in this town, and it's not going to be a good one. And so I remember being like really pushed and forced to be a leader because there wasn't any other option. I sometimes think like, oh, well, maybe had I gone somewhere else, I wouldn't have been a leader, right? And so, Mukwonago made me stronger. That adversity made me better, made me stronger. But again, that links me to that pain and that oppression, right? And gives credit to white supremacy also. That town did not make me stronger. I was strong before that. And so when we think about healing, how can we acknowledge and name our pain, but not be forever linked to that, not be forever linked to our oppression? And this is not about erasure, right? Like that is part of my story that I hang on to, but it doesn't define me. I was strong before that. And when we think, especially as BIPOC folks, about our pain, our trauma, that often is passed down through generations, right? There are multiple forces that have been created, a bloodline of trauma in our bodies from genes, history, culture, laws, family. Passed down. It does not mean that we are defective. Quite the opposite, actually, right? That happened to us. We survived because of our resilience, which was also passed down to us from previous generations. And so finding a way to be more than our pain, to acknowledge not just the trauma, although we need to deal with that, but the resilience that was passed down as well. And I believe that there is trauma that needs to be dealt with within the white body as well. Intergenerational trauma passed down, as well as intergenerational resilience. I don't know what healing might look like for white folks, but I know that it is important, and I believe that we are all a part of this equation. And as white folks, sometimes thinking like, I don't need to heal from racism, your healing can be liberating for all of us. And if you don't heal, if you don't figure out how you need to heal, the scars that I have or other BIPOC folks have, they're often only healed until they are rewounded again. Okay, so number 2, remember when I talked about Midwest nice and how it's conditional? Well, I wanted to tell you really quickly about an unconditional kindness. Unconditional niceness. Unconditional niceness looks like my mom buying bags of candy for trick or treat. We didn't have a big neighborhood, but she bought lots of bags of candy, right? Even though we were never visited by any trick-or-treaters. No one would come to our house, to the best of my memory. Now, this may seem like a small gesture, but I think it takes an incredible act of love and patience to continue to believe in people, to care for a people that never showed us that in return. And then to watch my dad continue that gesture years after my mom passed away. It was just a couple of years ago, in fact, that I discovered a stash of candy at my parents' house and asked my dad, who is diabetic, "Why do you have so much candy, Dad?" And he replied, "It's for the trick-or-treaters." We never had a single trick-or-treater in those 30 years. And in some ways, that story is heartbreaking. But in other ways, it's such a beautiful testimony to what unconditional niceness looks like, can look like. But here's also the thing. Being nice, even unconditionally, doesn't end racism. It didn't get us out of the Badlands. It doesn't move us toward healing that we all need to do. So I want to show you a quick video clip. Justin, I'm forgetting his last name, but there's a video clip. First name Justin. He would say, "Don't be nice." I'm going to say, detox yourself from niceness.
Don't be nice is a popular saying among performance poets. It's often shouted at people as they step to the stage like, "Don't be nice, poet!" This is not meant to psych them out, but to remind them to not hold back, to say everything that needs to be said. If you're like me, not being nice is hard. You want to wave at everyone, smile the kind of smiles that make happy emojis jealous, play sports with the greatest sportsmanship of all time. Being nice makes my life nice. It gives me approval from others, and I love approval. You could say I approve of approval. Being nice allows me to avoid conflict, and I do not love conflict. You could say I have a conflict with conflict, but do not tell this to conflict because I don't want it to get upset. I wish there was a place called Nice World where we could all go and be really nice to each other, where every car was manufactured with a second, gentler horn, and when you honk it, it goes, "Excuse me, don't mean to be rude, but there's a green light up ahead." A world where everyone floats around and the only currency is hugs, but we live in an actual world with stores that don't accept hugs, Target. A world with gravity and friction and evil forces, a world that demands we be more than nice sometimes. Nice by itself is parsley. It's the lemon on the rim of your sweet tea, the cucumbers in your salad. It's not that cucumbers aren't great. They are. But alone, they will not sustain us. Being nice lacks real nutritional value. I used to tell myself the main reason I was being nice was to contribute to society's greater good. That by smiling and nodding politely at all times, I was one of the good guys, a Batman for harmony. But if I'm being real, My need to keep others happy is not altruistic. It's selfish. It comes from a place of approval seeking, from avoiding tension. There are times when I am nice because it is safe. When my desire to keep people comfortable trumps my desire to keep them honest, there are times when I feel like a 6'1" stalk of parsley, like a man made entirely of cucumbers. When a friend catcalled a waitress at a bar, I said nothing. When a mover saw me sticking books underneath my bed frame to balance it and suggested I use the Quran, I said nothing. When a relative told me he doesn't have a problem with black people, but I said nothing. My actions spoke for me. They said, I'm not a bad person, but I've heard that in order to give a talk like this, you're supposed to be an expert at something, and it embarrasses me to tell you that I've been an expert at closing my mouth, at telling myself it's not my place, that I can't change someone, that I should just be quiet and smile. When I look back at the moments I am most ashamed of, it is always the times I needed to go beyond nice, but didn't. Because I felt the urge to protect people's feelings, even when those people had feelings that were racist or misogynistic or homophobic. Something inside told me to play nice, to avoid offending the offensive. My mom has a bulletin board, a quote with a bullet that's pinned to the bulletin board above her desk that reads, always be a little kinder than necessary. And I appreciate this sentiment. I've had days made by cashiers who took the time to ask me about mine. Evenings lit up by the unprompted smiles of strangers. I believe in being friendlier than you need to, in forgiving those who make mistakes, in leaving a penny without expecting one in return. But I also believe there are times when this world needs a talking to, where we must be willing to make people uncomfortable. I hate making people uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable. I stammer. My face turns red. I don't always come up with the right words, but I've come to realize that sometimes being uncomfortable is more necessary than being nice. That saying something will always have a greater impact than saying nothing. That addressing people for being terrible doesn't make you terrible. Can you imagine how much less of a hero Batman would be if he was constantly afraid of making the Joker upset? If he saw Bane destroy Gotham and change the subject to the weather? Sometimes being good means being kinder than required. But sometimes it means standing up to the jokers, pushing past discomfort, giving the world what is necessary even when it doesn't feel so nice. I realize we are not all performance poets stepping to the stage, but wherever we are walking towards, let us remember to not hold back, to say what needs to be said, even if our faces turn red or we stutter or the room gets a little uncomfortable. Let us blare our horns when we need to be heard. Add some greens to the cucumber salad. Let us not be nice. Let us be more. Let us be good. Thank you.
Okay. That was Justin Lamb. So this is not, these aren't the best options, but I just want to do a quick check-in to see like if any of that resonated with any of you, if anyone's feeling personally attacked. So just wondering that this idea of Midwest nice or just nice in general, right, of conflict-averse, does this show up in you? So you might answer yes, and it runs deep, surfaces here and there, I'm not really sure, or no, I'm not a nice person, quote unquote. Okay, so we got almost 60 people taking the poll. Majority say yes, and it runs deep, and then a third say it surfaces here and there. All right. So, just some continued reflection that we don't have time for right now, but if you will hang on to this. How have you embodied or observed Midwest nice, or this idea of niceness, in problematic ways? And what are ways that you have or could prevent niceness from being a barrier to anti-racism? So detox yourself from niceness. And so those of us from the Midwest may have the most work to do, I'm not sure. And this problematic niceness tends to run deep when those Midwest nice folks live in white bodies and in segregated white spaces. But this niceness can show up in many of us across racial lines. And the thing about niceness is that it is not courageous. And we need courage. Right? I'm not, like Justin, not advocating for meanness. But niceness doesn't end racism. And in fact, sometimes that works against each other, I would argue. I've seen niceness uphold racism. Bold is the new nice. What would you do if you had nothing to fear in this work? So I would say stop being worried about being disliked. Stop protecting the feelings of the offender at the expense of those who have been offended. Stop whitewashing history, Martin Luther King Jr., all of the things to make it nicer. Stop being so conflict-averse. No racial progress has ever been made without conflict. Get your people. And stop asking for your happy ending. Sure, it can be painful to hold these stories, to not find positivity. I can't tell you how many times in this work, in these conversations, people will say, but Amanda, can you, let's just focus on how far we've come, right? Or tell me how this played out in a good way, right? Like people wanting to feel good about themselves, wanting the happy ending. And I would ask you to reject that, because while it can be painful to not have that happy ending, it's a clean pain, which I don't have time to get into, but you could find in that book, My Grandmother's Healing, there's clean pain and there's dirty pain, and clean pain is a necessary pain for us to move through and toward healing. So when I talk about rejecting the happy ending syndrome, I wanted to help you out for a moment. So last year, my father passed away, and he still lived on that property in Mukwonago. And when my sisters and I went to close out the estate, I wondered if Snoop Dogg, who also still lived next door, if he had done any of his own healing, if he had any reckoning. Maybe he would stop over to give his condolences with an apology. Maybe we'd find a sympathy card in the mailbox. I don't even know that I wanted these things. I don't know how I might have responded, actually. But on one of those days that we spent trying to move through the grief, sifting through belongings to try to find some closure, we looked up and we saw Snoop Dogg walking around the perimeter of our property along a very busy highway. That's the front of our property that no one should walk on if you don't want to get hit. He walked around the entire perimeter of our property as we were grieving my dad's death. And he just watched. And we were surveilled one last time. Sometimes there is not a happy ending. There are many of us that don't have the privilege to expect one. And when those wounds are reopened a bit, as they were reopened a bit, I can at least say that it was a clean pain that I had to move through. Not a dirty one that I believe he will have to reckon with. And so lastly, we must all break with white solidarity. And this goes beyond the individual level and into systems talk. And I don't have enough time to share all of the examples of when people have chosen not to do this. Right? And I can't answer for everyone what this might look like, but I wanted to at least put it up here to leave you with that. What does that look like for you? And on this point, I will just say that there is more to my story with Snoop Dogg and too many others. But I will leave that for another time. Until then, I hope that our wounded society will start to embark on our individual and our collective communal truth and reconciliation processes if we actually want to heal. And so, I will wrap it up there. And before I take your questions, I wanted to ask you to sit with some of my questions. What does it look like for you to break with white solidarity? And I'm not just looking at white folks, right? There's a lot of this internalized pain, racism, trauma that's in BIPOC folks as well. How do we break with white solidarity? How have you facilitated inward healing, racial healing for yourself, which in turn is for the rest of us? And with that, how have you contributed to collective communal healing for all of us? And what are the mile markers of progress along your journey toward racial healing? And we don't have the time right now, but I would ask you to have this conversation with yourself, with your people, with your circles. What can you point to? What is your compass? How do you bring others along? Because we all need to engage in racial healing. So with that, this is the same QR code where you can, I'm not sure if I'll be able to get your questions. Oh yes, I actually can see some on the phone. So I will try to look at these as well, but we have just a few minutes, so I apologize for the shortened time, but a few minutes to take maybe a couple questions. Pat will pass around a microphone, so I'd be happy to take any question or comment, feedback from your audience, or you can try to bring it into this poll.
If you do have a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. We just ask that you keep your mask on, and I'll hold the microphone to where we can hear you. Heading right over. Excuse me.
Yeah, so
It's on.
is it on? Can you hear me? Okay. good.
Yes.
I usually don't need a microphone, but so I grew up in a racially segregated, 90%. I mean, through my whole life, obviously, those statistics were alarming. I mean, you don't think that it's that drastic. So what do you do with that? I mean, it feels like it was an uncontrolled circumstance of mine, that I didn't realize what was going on. You want to take action, but it's pretty depressing, obviously. So I have 3 little girls at home, and what's the action? I mean, obviously there's 100,000 actions that you could probably take, but internally it's kind of, you feel like you didn't do that, but then obviously that reflects in your behaviors. So I'm just curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I was telling actually Laura, my friend, I had to give a shout out to Laura because I was like really leaning on her for support with this. But I was telling Laura, like, the Q&As, I feel like we do them backwards, because why ask like one person when we could ask everyone, right? There's wisdom in the room. And so I would love to throw that back out to all of you. I know we don't have a ton of time, but again, hopefully it's something like a conversation we can have within community, because I think the answer maybe looks different for everyone, but also I think that there's more that we can find together. I would say, though, just really quickly, there are a lot of choices that were made, beyond our circumstances, like that we didn't have choice in, especially as children. I think as we grow older, we have more choice. So that is something to look at. I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to simplify it, because I think it can be certainly harder based on geography. But I think really looking at your circles of influence and your power, right? And one, just noticing and naming that, right? Like sitting with that, especially if it's not anything that you paid attention to before or noticed that much. Like, I think that's a really important piece of it, is just understanding our conditioning, because then when you do engage with folks and your worldview is challenged, then you'll have something to draw from instead of, I think sometimes when I see white folks in particular maybe try to move through healing, it's really painful for some of the rest of us, and I think it's because there's just so many people I've encountered whose worldview has never been challenged, and so in the classroom when I taught, there would be students who, were just pissed off about, anything that I said, and, you're really biased and you're really one-sided, and I remember just thinking, and I think even saying, if this is the first time you're hearing this or being challenged by this, you might want to consider that your entire life up until this point was biased and one-sided, not me, right? But I think that's what happens when we just just stay over there and nothing is challenged, and then when you go outside of that world, most people don't respond very well. So I think that there is something to be said for, if that's where you're at, and you don't have any control over those circumstances, at least naming and acknowledging it and understanding what comes with that. But I do think that there are ways that we can work to change some of those things through policies, through local politics and governance, as far as when you understand, which I don't understand at all, but how some of these things were set up and how these the segregation is not an accident, right? It's very much on purpose. And so I'll just leave it there, but I appreciate the question, and I'm happy to anyone who's willing to engage in this in from a place of humility and genuine, I'm really trying to get there, I'm wherever you're at in your journey, I'm happy to be in it with you, and so feel free to contact me, and we can continue that conversation. Another one back there?
Yes, we got another question back here, Amanda.
Hi, Amanda. I want to say thank you very much for the last hour. I'm a teacher in town, 4th and 5th grade, and I think I play a very important role in this process. Are there things I can be doing in the classroom, working with 10, 11, 12-year-olds to start at that age level within an 8-hour period each day? Are there things I can be doing on a daily basis?
Yes.
Can you share a few
Thank
of those?
Oh, you want
I would love to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. I think teachers are so important and so powerful. Again, I'm going to just invite you I'd be happy to have a separate conversation with you, but there is so much, and if there's any other educators, even working with much younger kids, and especially when I talk about racism, and these aren't my words, but there are many folks who I've talked with and leaned on that might share similar identities, or just as a person of color who noticed and experienced these things at a really young age. Lots of times 2nd grade is a common time frame. And somebody had said, if children of color are old enough to experience racism, then white children are old enough to learn about it. And, I'm not sure how much you're following critical race theory efforts. It's not new, it's just always called something else, but there are always these forces working against these kinds of conversations in the classroom around identity, about power, about privilege, about structures, about accurate history, and just our everyday interactions that can go beyond kindness and can look more like anti-racism and hopefully also racial justice, and then connecting all of the oppressions. And so, yeah, I joke a little bit just saying yes, but there are many things, and I think that teachers have incredible responsibility and can make so much difference. And so, I mean, from books to curriculum to representation to like noticing how we are like engaging with folks or not. And sometimes it's not even that hard. I was talking to I've been doing a lot of work with schools across the state, and I often am asked to work with white educators and administrators, because that's often like who is there, right? But I'm like, I want to talk with the communities of color if they're asking me to come in and talk about racism. And I've just not been able to let go of this group of students of color who I have been asking, what is your experience like? And do you have a teacher that you can turn to, that you trust, that you could share your experiences with? And they all answered just this one teacher, and I was like, "That's it? That's all that you have?" And so I was trying to get to well, what does she do that makes her safe, and that makes her trust you? And so then they started thinking a little bit, and then all of a sudden, somebody else said, "Oh, I guess there is one other teacher," because they were saying well, she knows our names and she knows our family. She's come to our house. This one student said, "Oh, I guess there is this other teacher," and she named this teacher. And I was like, "Okay, what is it about him that you connect with?" And she said, "He asks me how I'm doing." That's it. Right? And I know it's not that simple, but the connection and the building meaningful relationships is so huge. And so sometimes I think we even overthink it, and it's just she was genuinely serious. He asks me how I am doing. He asks about my family. So I think that there's something to be said for those small acts of connection as well. Oh, yeah.
Hi. So to kind of meld together those first two questions, so after George Floyd's death, like many white people, I really reacted strongly to that, and finally at 30 years old realized that I had a lot to learn, and started a book club with some other white friends, as many people did, and we really started learning together. And I felt much like the first question asker, just realizing or feeling like you didn't choose this, and yet this is, something you're perpetuating, and feeling overwhelmed and maybe powerless, really feeling like I had no influence over it. And there are people that I could point to as obvious influencers, I guess, like teachers or politicians, all kinds of people who I felt like actually had power to change this, and I just felt like I did not have any power, which is amazing because I will just share that I work in medical education. So I am an educator of physicians and other medical professionals, and it did not occur to me that was a position of power, among other things in my life. We all have, positions of power and influence, and it took my friends that I was in this book club with to help me recognize how I could utilize my positions to, I guess, I'm not in a position to educate on these issues, but to bring awareness and to, bring forth that kind of education. And I just wonder if a lot of other white people feel that way, well, what can I do about it? I'm a whatever in my job, or, I have this role in life and I have no influence over this, but we all do, I'm sure, in some way. So I just wonder what your suggestions are for how people could find those positions of power and influence that they have.
You're all questions. Yeah, I appreciate, thank you for sharing. I think that, the systems in general, but certainly of white supremacy works in many mysterious ways, and one of those ways is to disempower people, right? And so I think when we feel that come up in ourselves, well, who am I? I'm just one person, or I can't do a lot. I don't have any influence. That's not true. And I think that's the system really working as it does very well to if everyone feels so disempowered, who's going to do anything? And so I think while it's a very real feeling and reaction for folks. I think if we can shift that narrative and like reject it and be able to name that as a way that like white supremacy is working within all of us, maybe that can be an entryway or a path toward actually feeling and finding and discovering the power that we do all hold. And it can be such little things, like I said. I mean, I think sometimes we think about it needs to be this like grand heroic act, right? And that like, wow, that would be great. There are many times it doesn't work like that. And so these small little things on even the everyday level are really important and I think would also address some of those bigger systemic issues as well. But I think, I don't know, it's again, I think the book clubs, the community conversations, whatever it may be, where you can find people and spaces to grapple with and to hold each other accountable. And when that comes up in us, to say like, no, we do have power, and it might take some effort to figure out what that is, but expend that effort then, right? Like, and figure out your why. Like, what is it? Why do you care? Why? Like, and maybe that's what we like, and figure out why. I think sometimes that when people benefit from a system, there isn't always like an urgency to change anything, right? But again, also if like, especially, I'll say white folks in particular, like if you can see how you have lost so much too, right? Like of your humanity oftentimes, or of genuine connections with communities that you might not be exposed to. Like there's so much that we've lost too of how this hurts all of us. And so I don't know if that would help with any urgency, but really being able to see like, figure out your why and letting that anchor you, because there are so many forces that are gonna push back and work against it. And what you named is absolutely one of them. We just feel disempowered. I don't know, that's all I got. Hopefully that's worth something. But again, I would turn to each other, and there's wisdom, I know, in all of us and in this room, so.
Amanda, I think we have 2 more questions and then some closing announcements after those, so.
Okay.
Go ahead. Yes, this is on.
Thank you, Amanda, for a great talk today. I don't know exactly how to phrase this as a question, but I've been in the schools and with the Black student leaders, advocating with Hope Restorers, and I think what I've experienced on my side and the white side is immense frustration from because of white people. And I've been there myself, where I've read Waking Up White, and other people have read Waking Up White, and I've noticed that a lot of people think they're done now with the Waking Up White. I got it. And my frustration is going beyond that into just the reading of it and knowing it, but to have concept and practice changes. And then all of a sudden that moment of, I totally get it and see what I've been doing wrong. And it seems like maybe that nice stuff you're talking about is the barrier to go beyond just reading the book. And I guess I don't really have a question to that, but I don't know how to get folks past that. And because I've been working with the Black community, I think that's been my main source of getting it and going past, listening and watching their life. And I hear people here wondering, well, what do we do? I can't make white people get it myself, and it took me a long time to get it, but it was when I immersed myself into the life of these other people who we stay away from. I suddenly taste it, and I don't just see pictures of the food, I actually get to taste it. Mm-hmm. And so I guess I would encourage folks and myself, which I'm trying to do, is to step out of my comfort and talk to people who are different than ourselves. Go to their homes, invite them to your homes, have meals. I just spent the morning with one of the directors of Hope Restores, and she's going to come over and bring me some food. And I was so excited, because that would be a first for me. And I think that's how we have to take these questions past just asking and getting answers and going home.
Mm-hmm.
So I thank you so much. It's just awesome today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for that. There's so much wisdom in that. And I think that is that, and again, the book of my grandmother's hands, it's like a workbook and a book, but, and he argues in it that like so much of the work or the progress that we think we've made has very much been, like on this cognitive level. And so yes, sure, we maybe have laws, but if we haven't changed anything, changed like the hearts and, the bodies of people, then like that's why we haven't gotten very far. And so that, I think that too, where the book clubs, I think are great. And I think that works for a lot of people. But I also see lots of folks stay at it like in these conversations from a very intellectual, academic lens, and it probably it's safer, it's more comfortable, and that doesn't change us. I think like we do have to be able to figure out how to feel, and I think there's sometimes a numbness that comes with some folks. I've experienced it with a lot of white folks in particular. Even though there might be tears or feelings, there's also this like numbness sometimes, and I'm just like it's hard work. It's hard work, but it's hard work too, and we can't just stay up here and that hasn't clearly that hasn't gotten us very far. So anyway, that's some of what I heard you say, and so I appreciate that. Thank you.
It's like everything else in our culture. We go to college, we learn it, but then we have to have an internship, and then we have to go out and do it.
Yes.
But we don't do that with this. We just stop and think it's okay.
Yep.
So thank you a lot.
Yeah, well said. Thank you.
Hi, Amanda.
Hey, friend.
Is it on?
I don't think so.
There, is that better?
Yes.
Oh, all right. So my difficulty is, how do you break through to our white friends and coworkers this feeling of being scared, being bristled up when you start talking about it, because a lot of times it's like we want to have these conversations, but people kind of put up that wall and say, I don't want to talk about it because I'm going to feel uncomfortable or I'm going to be vulnerable. I think you kind of know where I'm going with this. With the people that I work with, we have to put up walls. We have to do that. How do we break through and say, hey, it's okay to feel this messiness. It's okay to say, I don't know the answers or the things that I've done in the past. How do you just a couple of tips to break through that, to get into that I think you have to get to a position of vulnerability. How do you get past that little zone of maybe not wanting to, not wanting to open up? I'm confused about that myself. Mm-hmm. How do I break through that to my friends and coworkers to get them to kind of look? I don't know if that makes sense.
It does, and I guess my first just honest answer is I don't know. I've been trying to figure that out too. But another just quick plug with the book. I don't mean to keep plugging the book, but there was so much that I was like, I learned so much, and the way the author broke it down is like this: here's like white bodies, here's like black and brown bodies, and here's law enforcement bodies. And so that book is like addresses those three ways that trauma has been stored in each of those bodies. And so just want to share that with you. But I don't know. I think that like we just have to normalize the discomfort and the the messy. Yes, I was thinking, say yes to the mess, the messiness. Of this, and I don't know, and just to like there is no other way. There's no way around it. And I know sometimes people, I don't know, this maybe I don't know that this makes sense, but I've heard some people talk about it like a cancer. People have talked about like racism is like the cancer of our society, and I certainly have had, I think many of us have been touched by cancer, and I've certainly had that in my family. And I think someone talked about like racism as far as cancer, and if you think about like chemo, and that like, and people make choices for different reasons, but that like moving through, like finding if there's a treatment for this cancer, it doesn't feel good, right? And it can actually like be really painful to move, really hard to move through. But when like we're able to like create spaces and understanding for like, that might be like the only option here, right? Like that's what you need to move through. And on the other side of that is liberation and is healing. But you can't get there without moving through that, right? Without choosing to go through a treatment that might make you feel sicker, right? Or like, and it's scary for sure, but I think like being able to normalize it and help people understand that like, I just haven't found another way around the discomfort. We have to move through it. And so, I mean, that obviously it's not compelling enough for most people, but I think like if we can, like, again, we all have circles of influence. And so if maybe there's something that you could say with folks, or maybe someone else could say that might get through to them more, because I don't know how many different ways, like, I don't know that there's a lot of different ways to say that. And so maybe it's more about like just building trust and connections where somebody might like take that leap with you. But I don't know.
I apologize because I see a few hands still going up. We are out of time, and we'll maybe be able to take a question afterwards, just one-on-one. I want to thank people for coming today. You do have the evaluation forms. Could I borrow that for just a second? Well, so we have 3 ways that you can fill out the evaluation form. One is paper copy, which you have right now. And if you're so inclined to just take a couple minutes to fill it out while you're here. If you're like me, once you leave here, it's real hard to get back to it. But there is a QR code on here also. So you can, for those of you with a smartphone, you can take a picture of that and it'll bring you to the evaluation. We will also be sending you one through the email that you can fill out. And so for people online too, obviously you don't have the QR code in the paper copy. You will get this, that'll come to you probably in the next day or two. Many good questions, and for me, my own personal journey really revolved around entering into these courageous conversations, these really tough conversations. But the book chats are a wonderful way to sit down with 2 facilitators, one white facilitator, one person of color, and then 6 total participants. So it's a small group, and you can really start getting some ideas on what's the language I use? How can I become more comfortable or more bold, as you brought up? And it just takes practice. It does take a long time. Just getting tingles, just working with Amanda is amazing. Please offer her a very warm applause.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.